the entire automotive industry is getting out of fossil fuel burning engines into electric, and whether electric is the ultimate answer or if we got to go hydrogen, we got to think about the exact same dramatic shift that we will need to take a turn in direction if we want to fight AMR. If we continue on this course, it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to be as drastic short term as COVID, but it is that silent pandemic where, if unchanged, and again, the studies are there, the reports are there, by the year 2050, if we continue, then we would have up to 10 million people a year die from multi-drug resistant infections. And that at a cost of potentially up to 100 trillion. That would be more people dying from AMR superbugs than from cancer and other major diseases combined.
This is the Public Health Insight Podcast. Before we move on, it is important to note that the views expressed in this podcast are our own and do not represent any of the organizations we work for or are affiliated with.
In the previous episode, Will and Gordon spoke to Mr. Oliver Schacht, the CEO of a precision medicine company known as Opgen, about the drivers of antimicrobial resistance, AMR, the impact of COVID-19, and how precision medicine can help to combat emergence of AMR. In the final part of the discussion, Mr. Schacht remains to discuss the geographical distribution of antimicrobial resistant infections, why Big Pharma no longer prioritizes the research and development of new antibiotics or other antimicrobials, and the need for coordinated multi-sectoral approaches to tackle AMR as a top 10 global threat. This is where they left off.
When we're talking about antimicrobial resistance, compared to a lot of other global health threats, is this something that's affecting more higher income countries, more lower income countries, a mix of both? Is everyone kind of at risk here, or what's from your experience, what are you seeing here?
It is truly a global threat. Bacteria do not discriminate between rich and poor. They do not discriminate between ethnicities. They do not discriminate between geographies on the planet. You may see slight variations in prevalence of certain bugs in certain parts of the world, but that challenge of, hospital superbugs is a global challenge. And unfortunately, it also requires a global response. And I think if there is anything good coming out of the COVID pandemic, the one good thing that I sincerely hope that we're all going to remember is there is a tremendous value of rapid infectious disease diagnostics. That is the first step. Of course, you eventually need to treat it. Vaccines are great, but without a rapid diagnosis, you don't know what you're facing. So we're seeing it. There are geographic variances. So within the United States, for example, you see significantly higher prevalence of AMR in the northeast of the country. New York, Boston, D.C. Not too surprising. These are densely populated urban centers with a lot of travel in normal circumstances. Certainly somewhat less here in the last year and a half, but these AMR superbugs get spread globally very quickly through people moving around the planet. And then, you'll find them more often than not starting out in densely populated areas. If you look at Europe, again, one of the things you see, the farther south and east you go, the worse it gets. You go north to Scandinavia, it's significantly less of a challenge than if you go to Italy or Spain or Greece. You go to the Middle East, you're seeing some of the worst AMR bugs that you could imagine. And part of that has to do with climate, but far more important is the philosophy and how we use and how we prescribe antibiotics. As Opgen, we do a lot of business in the Middle East. Some of the conversations I've had with leading experts in these countries and leading microbiologists, when you sort of ask them, well, is the challenge that, antibiotics in your country are available over the counter? And I've literally had leading physicians look at me, lean forward and say, no, Oliver, it's not over the counter, it's under the counter. If you realize that some of these countries, and it's true in parts of very well-developed Asian countries, Japan being a prime example, you're able to get, for just about any infection you might have, you can get yourself just about any antibiotic. There are parts of this world where you're able to walk into a pharmacy and purchase, out of pocket, the last reserve antibiotics. Colistin is a drug of last resort. So when all else fails, when you've kind of determined that your standard broad-spectrum antibiotics don't work, your next line of defense, your third line of defense doesn't work, the last drug that still, in many, many cases, tends to work is colistin. Why? Well, because it has dramatic side effects. It has liver and kidney toxicity, which is the reason we haven't been using it in the developed world for the last 30, 40 years, or only very, very rare that we've been using it. But that's why it's still so effective. Now, if we're using those last line of defense drugs to self-treat a common, sometimes really not life-threatening infection, we're really going to be creating situations, and there are already AMR markers indicative of certain bacteria that have become resistant to colistin, which really then you're out of options. And at that point, again, you may face situations where nothing works. If you, and I know I said I didn't want to comment on agriculture too much, but one of the situations is we use antibiotics in farming, and some of it, of course, is justified. But the reality is, at a global scale, one of the side effects of antibiotics is not just to keep animals healthy, it is to have them grow faster, put on meat faster. It's pure economic calculus there. If you know that colistin as a drug, which again is the last line of defense in human infections, is being used in pork farming in China, you can imagine that may very well create situations that are going to, potentially spiral out of control quite quickly. So it will require, and in many respects, AMR as one of the existential threats to humanity. Again, the World Health Organization put it out there as one of the 10 most dangerous threats to human health, is like climate change. The science has been around for 20 plus years. There was a report in the year 2000, which I remember vividly, by the World Health Organization. The report was called Bad Bugs, No Drugs. That report saw an update in, I believe it was 2018, and the reality is not only did everything that they had projected in the year 2000 have become true, it happened faster, and it was far worse. Now, again, you take the analogy of climate change. If anybody had told us, and I come from Germany originally, the heartland of some of the finest automotive companies in the world, if anybody had told me 10 years ago that I, in my lifetime, would see a situation where the entire automotive industry is getting out of fossil fuel burning engines into electric, and whether electric is the ultimate answer or if we got to go hydrogen, we got to think about the exact same dramatic shift that we will need to take a turn in direction if we want to fight AMR. If we continue on this course, it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to be as drastic short term as COVID. But it is that silent pandemic where, if unchanged, and again, the studies are there, the reports are there, by the year 2050, if we continue, then we would have up to 10 million people a year die from multi-drug resistant infections. And that at a cost of potentially up to 100 trillion. That would be more people dying from AMR superbugs than from cancer and other major diseases combined. So it is one of those existential threats that we really need to take seriously. But it's also, as I said earlier, it almost doesn't matter if we take action here in the U.S. or if there's, a happy island somewhere in Europe, let's call it Switzerland, that, kind of decides we need to take a global approach. Because if we don't, it doesn't matter. If we try to fight it just at home, we don't realize that these bugs will travel with people around the planet within less than a day. Those outbreaks, can come hit us at any time. And again, that's my hope that it was a wake-up call to us, all of us. And the good news here is we have drugs, unlike COVID, where it's a virus and we don't have drugs, but we do have drugs. We have dozens and dozens of antibiotics. They're very effective drugs, and they work. We just can't continue overusing them. And we have diagnostics. These solutions exist today. We don't have to scramble to get out. These tests are there. We just got to use them. And then thirdly, it's about education and messaging. It's mind-boggling that some of the very simple things about antibiotic stewardship, simple, being smart about how you test patients, how you isolate patients, how you take care of them, and combine that stewardship with approaches to therapeutics as well as diagnostics in your hospital. When I grew up in the 1970s, my parents used to take my sister and I to the pediatric doctor. Every time we had an infection, it was Bactrim, kind of like hard-hitting antibiotic. It was as much a shut up the parent kind of drug as it was trying to treat the infection in the child. My son has not seen an antibiotic in his almost 12 years on this planet, because we really should reserve antibiotics to those situations, those serious infections when you really, really need them. Vast majority of infections that we face are viral in the community, and frankly, antibiotics, not only do they not work, every time we use antibiotics in those situations, we're compounding the problem of AMR.
Wow, that was a very comprehensive explanation, Oliver. And I think what really struck a chord with me was the comparison AMR and climate change, and just that it's, number one, it's not like a single issue. There's so many different layers to it. You have to peel it back, and everything is so connected. As we've all seen with COVID, but it's such a global issue. And as well, it's, I guess, treating the problem, but also there's education, policy, regulation, and all sorts of legislative and other. It's like an whole society approach as well as global approach, and everyone needs to kind of get on board.
And COVID, ironically, unfortunately may have aggravated and exacerbated the situation for AMR. If you look at the reality that millions and millions of patients that have been hospitalized with COVID-19 in hospitals around the globe, there are some meta-studies out there, typically between 70% and 80% of all of these hospitalized patients have been given broad-spectrum antibiotics. On the flip side, you look at the data that's emerging now, and again, depending on which study you look at, in some studies it's as low as 7% to 14%. In some studies, and we've done some clinical trial work with COVID patients, it can be as high as 20 or 25% of patients with COVID that actually get a bacterial co-infection while in the hospital. And of course, if you get a bacterial co-infection, you need antibiotics to treat them. But if you look at that delta, you look at like the 70 to 80% of all patients getting the broad spectrum antibiotics, and the 7% to maybe 20-25% who should be getting it, it's easy to see that we're overtreating by a factor of 3 to 4 at least, maybe by a factor of 10. And again, I understand it. If you're a doctor, and half my family are intensive care doctors, and my brother-in-law has had to triage COVID patients, it's a decision that frankly no person should ever have to make between, do I continue giving oxygen to one patient? If I take it off, I triage, I give it to another, I know that other person's going to die. I understand that out of an overabundance of caution, doctors have been using broad spectrum antibiotics in COVID patients not because they think those drugs would work to treat COVID, but because the fear that if those patients that are already struggling health-wise, if they were to get a bacterial co-infection, it could be, basically a life and death question. But again, by doing so, we have treated millions and millions of patients with broad-spectrum antibiotics who didn't need them, frankly shouldn't have gotten them, and it is almost certain that we will have led to a situation where we see higher rates of multi-drug resistant organisms in these hospitals, in these wards, emerging. And the data starts to emerge, and again, it always comes with a time lag, so we're just now starting to see some data from 2020. We're probably going to see the 21 data next year, but you have some wholesale shifts of various broad-spectrum antibiotic in terms of usage. It's gone up dramatically. And the reality is, since we tried to avoid doing any elective surgeries or anything that wasn't immediately necessary, that's mostly driven by COVID treatment. And so again, it's never an easy decision, but we may wake up, hopefully once we've gotten the whole COVID situation behind us, and find out that that threat of antimicrobial resistance, not only has it not gone away, it's actually deteriorated, and it's that much bigger of a challenge, and it's that much more important and time critical that we take decisive action.
Awesome. So, some people, might say, Mr. Schacht, you're being a little bit alarmist. Medical technology and precision medicine have come a long way. People assume that, the process of researching, developing, producing new drugs is at a rapid pace. It took 1 year to make a COVID-19 vaccine. However, you've been stating throughout this conversation, alluding to that this is not the case for all types of drugs. So can you talk specifically about those challenges associated with the research and development of new antimicrobials in general, rather?
Look, I mean, it's been a phenomenal success to the global healthcare and life sciences industry. And I'm president of the German Biotech Industry Organization and vice chair of the International Council of Biotech Associations here in DC. I've said so repeatedly over the last several months on stage. I've never been more proud being part of the biotech industry than in these last 18 months. So what that has proven is our ability, if there is a true will at a global scale to come together, fight together, get the job done, that we can. But don't forget, that's when all countries, or at least many countries with highly sophisticated technologies and companies and governments and funding, all of a sudden it was all stopgaps were taken out. You look at antimicrobials and antibiotics. If you look at the last 20 to 30 years, the reality is most companies, most big pharmaceutical companies, have gotten out of the development of novel antibiotics for a very simple reason, and it's a very logical reason. It's a lousy business. Now, you compare, if you're a pharmaceutical company and you have a choice to allocate R&D funding into developing a new antibiotic versus developing a new drug for, say, cancer or rheumatoid arthritis or a cardiovascular disease or diabetes. All of these other diseases are, no matter what drug you're developing, it usually takes a very similar amount of time and money. Let's call it an average 10 to 12 years and hundreds of millions, some would say over $1 billion to develop any drug. Now, with antibiotics, your challenge is if you give your drug to a patient, within 10 to maybe on the outside 20 days, that patient is either healthy and back home or dead. Whereas all these other drugs, you have a cancer patient, you're going to be given your drug for several years, in some cases, rheumatoid arthritis or cardiovascular, decades, at very different price tags. Historically, antibiotics tend to be cheap. And here's an added challenge. So basically, your return on investment just isn't there, which is why a lot of big pharma got out of the development. There's some biotech companies that kind of tried to pick up the baton and develop new antibiotics, and there are some. Couple of challenges with that. There are prime examples here in the United States. A very successful company that had taken a novel antibiotic all the way through the clinic, got an FDA approval, launched it, a company called Achaogen. Within a year of launch, company went into bankruptcy. Why? Well, because the challenge is, when you have these new drugs, you really want them to be your new last line of defense. You don't want doctors to use them. You put them on the shelf. Again, it's a bit like, you sort of look at sprinkler systems. Well, if sprinkler systems were only ever sold in situations where there's a fire, there wouldn't be any companies doing sprinkler systems. Now, there are requirements. So, again, there has been talk for well over a decade. We need to come up with new incentive systems. There have been suggestions of, pull incentives that could be north of $1 billion to any biotech or pharma company that is developing a new antibiotic. And governments could then, almost like an insurance policy. It almost begs the question, should we leave antimicrobials or antibiotics to private enterprise? Because again, you can't blame the pharmaceutical industry because they're making a rational economic decision. It is, again, as I said, it is lousy business. So it's a smart business decision, to go after new cancer drugs or go after, new Alzheimer's drugs or because you have that expectation that if you're successful, you will have patients that they're going to be taking those drugs for, in some cases, decades, and your price points are going to be much, much better. So, really fundamentally, there's a flaw in the system here. Now, the other piece, if you look at the pipeline of new antibiotics, there was a recent report by the WHO. There's roughly 70 to 80 new antibiotics in the pipeline in the clinic, which sounds great. I mean, it's good stuff. 80% of those drugs, we already know today there are existing genetic mechanisms for antimicrobial resistance for these new drugs coming out. It used to be 20, 30 years ago, you brought a new antibiotic to market, you probably had at least 5 to 10 years before that you'd ever see bugs becoming resistant against that drug. Unfortunately, that situation is no longer true. While there are some really amazing targeted kind of resistance-breaking drugs in the development pipelines, a lot of these companies are small biotechs, and they're struggling. They're struggling to raise capital because venture capitalists are deprioritizing companies developing new antibiotics for the exact same reason. Well, if there's no big pharma in that space, my exit as a venture capital investor isn't there because the odds of being acquired are much slimmer than when I have a new cancer drug. So again, it's all actors in the system are acting rationally and making smart economic choices. At a societal and healthcare systems level, it may very well not lead to the desired outcome. So again, I think we got to get creative and start thinking about incentives. Again, if it had not been for governments in Europe, in the United States, and Asia, around the world, making commitments of hundreds of millions in cumulative, actually billions of doses of these COVID vaccines, I'm not convinced whether Moderna or BioNTech, Pfizer or AstraZeneca would have ever developed those. Because it was those government commitments made very early on last year in spring that said, look, we're going to guarantee you to purchase, hundreds of millions of these products, and not, well, you go out and develop them, and if you bring them to market, we may, eventually buy some, but only in those cases where it's last defense, right? We really don't want people to take them. So, again, it's a fantastic lesson of how things can work, but we've got to take that lesson and then apply it and figure out, okay, what's the analogy here? How do we create incentives to get really innovative new antibiotics to market and encourage all of the stakeholders along the way, the companies, the investors, the regulatory authorities, because again, we've seen those vaccines being cleared in record time. You just give you the flip side, because it's all public knowledge. At Opgen, we have a product which is a rapid test for antimicrobial resistance, pending and sitting in front of the US FDA. That product has been sitting there for over a year now. I understand it. The US FDA is inundated with hundreds and hundreds of emergency use authorizations for COVID tests. The staff there are doing their absolute best. At a human level, it's a tragedy. They're overworked, underpaid, and underappreciated. But the reality is you have a product that would be a one-of-its-kind, first-in-class broad test for antimicrobial resistance simply stuck in a regulatory review process for over a year, which we could, basically take out and get to hospitals and labs. Now, we're now anticipating the FDA to complete its review here towards the end of August, so there is some light at the end of the tunnel. But those challenges, again, where there is a will, there's a way, but we've got to be willing to then go that path and bring new drugs through the pipelines faster and make it worth everybody's while.
It's the incentives, and it's almost finding like a perfect time and space. I don't know any other better way to put it, but it's finding all the conditions lining up, much like how we saw with COVID, vaccine development. Everything, all the conditions were right, and there was political will. And I think it really takes multiple governments, sectors, whether it's NGOs, private sector, public sector, all coming together to really tackle this issue together. And I think that's, for me, when I look at AMR, I think that really needs to be kind of to the path forward, right? Much like climate change or any other these global threats or risks. You really just can't be tackling it from one angle. or from, as an individual government or a sector. So my final question here, Oliver, is what do you kind of see being the future for antimicrobial, for responding to antimicrobial resistance outside of the pharma lens, or outside of the pharma field, from like more of like a broader all of society approach?
Great news here is all of the tools and technologies are there. We do not have to rely on a moonshot of some novel technology to all of a sudden come about. We have it. It exists. I would start with the first thing that needs to happen is a truly global multilateral approach. National governments, international associations, NGOs, whether it's the WHO, and really coming together at a global level. The second key piece is education and messaging. We've got to simplify, and again, with climate change, you talk to some of these climate scientists, part of the challenge is it is super complex. It's not simple stuff. You got to dumb it down to a point where, and I've just come back from Europe, when we've seen storms and flooding like I have not seen in my lifetime, with hundreds of people die and drown in their own homes. I don't know how many more warnings. You see the fires outside of Athens, or in the Mediterranean. You see the fires out in the west here in the United States. How much more of these events and disasters do we need? It's coming together, understanding, first of all, acknowledging that we have a problem. Houston, we've got a problem, and we have it at a global level. Now let's get together and then look at messaging, and education is going to go a long way. Deploying existing rapid testing and deploying it at a global level. And again, where there's a will, these tests, you're not talking about something that's super expensive. I mean, for some simple tests, it could be, in the $30 to $50. Some of the really sophisticated high-end hospital tests, you're probably going to look at something that costs between $100 and $200. But you've got patients that are intensive care where a single day on an ICU is going to cost you several thousands of dollars. So again, it's something that's absolutely doable with today's technology, today's solutions. If you understand you have a problem, you deploy the technologies, and you then use the existing regulatory framework to figure out ways of how do we accelerate things, how do we prioritize it from an approval standpoint. And then at the back end, and again, this is going to go down to healthcare systems and health insurance, how do we create, it's not even about a super incentive, it's just about acknowledging that there's got to be some way for anybody who develops any new solution, whether it's a new drug, a new diagnostic, or new device, there's got to be some reasonable amount of reimbursement. And again, as society, we've decided that we're absolutely willing to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to extend cancer patients' lives by a couple of years. It would behoove us well as mankind to figure out that it's probably not a bad idea to be able and willing to not say, well, a new antibiotic can only cost, $20 or $100. But if there's a reasonable amount here that ultimately allows people, and then, the system will work. We have a lot of smart science. It exists. We've seen computer science come to a point where we can now do next generation sequencing, where we can look at the entire sequence of a bacteria in a matter of hours at the cost of just a little over $100. Now, that allows you to look at the totality. We can use artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithms. We have cloud-based solutions that allow us to trace and track. The technology is all there. We just got to be, bringing people together and use it, and then deploy it with a focus of addressing that challenge. And the first order of business is admit that we have a real issue at hand. And then, I'm an optimist. Otherwise I wouldn't be an entrepreneur. I believe where there is a will, there is a way. And, I think it starts and ends with education. So, really discussions like this, just getting the word out and understanding that we've got an issue. Again, my prime example with climate change, I would never have dreamt that there is that wholesale change in industry. If we can shift people's minds and hearts, and then ultimately we'll see shift in resource deployment and novel technologies, and we're going to be in a good spot because, again, we have all the solutions and tools in our hands already today.
So, one of the things you keep coming back to throughout this conversation is this really requires a global solution. If it's a siloed approach, it's going to be hard to make a dent. And that brings me back to what you mentioned before about if we continue to use broad spectrum antibiotics until 2050, there could be 10 million deaths, I think you mentioned, in that time period. But when you look at the economic cost as well, it sounds like it's somewhere around in the $100 trillion ballpark. So while the return on investment might be low for a singular entity, there is a return on investment for the collective global because you're preventing premature years of life loss, you're preventing death and morbidity. So that speaks to the point where you're banging home. We need everyone's buy-in on this for it to be for us to achieve the greater societal good. So I think that's something that's apparent from what you've been describing.
Absolutely, 100% right. And again, I think it's at that level, it's not rocket science. It's always harder to convince people to spend money today on a greater societal good that's a few years out. But again, 20, 30 years, while it may seem a long time, really isn't in the grand scheme of things, and it will come around much faster than everybody thinks. And again, given how long it takes under most circumstances to develop any new product, again, you probably have another 2, maybe 3 product generations on the outside between today and 2050. So we better get started today.
People might be wondering, then, you've talked a lot about AMR, you've talked a lot about the solutions that are in place that just needs to be integrated for a global approach to at least, maybe we can never truly outpace, antimicrobial resistance. You mentioned that there's drugs in the pipeline for which there's already detected resistance to those drugs before it even comes to market. So people might be wondering, if we project out the future threat, the future danger, you mentioned WHO had put AMR as one of the biggest global threats. Will the second pandemic post 2020 be caused by a multi-drug resistant superbug? Back in the day, I know Yersinia pestis was a gram-negative bacteria that did cause a pandemic. So it's not far-fetched to think that something like that could happen again.
Absolutely. Will it? Who knows? Nobody knows, fortunately. Does it have the potential to be, a multi-drug resistant bacterial organism that could cause the next global pandemic? Absolutely, yes. And if it were to be one, the challenge might be, even greater because, again, trying to come up with a vaccine for bacterial infection may not be as easy as it has been for a relatively simple virus. I think it's as I said, it's a wake-up call. It has happened in the past. And let's not forget, bacteria have been on this planet for billions of years. They've been here, way before man ever was, and they will be here a long time after man is no longer on the planet. So, in a way, again, they're trying to survive. They will be here. We've just got to figure out a way of living with them, and be smart about how we do that.
Well, Oliver, I think it's been our pleasure to have you really on this podcast today to talk about this important issue. And I think you've reiterated many times that antimicrobial resistance is an issue for us all and as humanity. Maybe in closing, if you'd mind summarizing a couple of the key takeaway messages for our listeners back at home, and even some of the actions that the average person can do to join the fight against AMR. I think that would be super valuable.
If we think about AMR, the 3 letters, AMR, A as in actionable, M as in measurable, and R as in revolutionary. We have the ability to act, and that can be as simple as next time you go see your doctor for an infection, don't ask them for an antibiotic. Don't push them to prescribe antibiotics. They will likely do it, but in those cases where truly your disease requires an antibiotic, the doctor will tell you, but don't push for getting antibiotics, and spread the word. I think, again, if we can all collectively spread the word and understand that it's something we all got to join in and do together, then I think we're going to be in a good spot. And, we can lead the revolution with technologies that we have today and into the future, and address that challenge again, as we're showing with COVID that we can address these challenges. We're showing it with climate change that we are willing to change and adapt. And, as a species, that's the one optimistic piece I have. We've always been willing to adapt and change, and technology and innovation is a key driver of that. I think we have all the ingredients, and let's get it done together.
Amazing. Well, here to hear, folks. AMR, antimicrobial resistance, actionable, measurable, revolutionary. Thank you so much, Oliver.
Appreciate it, Will. Appreciate it, Gordon. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Public Health Insight Podcast, your go-to space for informative conversations, inspiring community action. If you enjoy our content and would like to stay up to date, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. To learn more about our community initiatives and how you can support us, visit our website at thepublichealthinsight.com. Join the PHI community, and let's make public health viral.